We have the most awesome panel at the World Science Festival for you. I do not say that lightly. George. Everybody will just come out. Drew Endy. Matthew Liao.
Hard to hear back.
Oh, you can't hear me. Okay, Drew, this is Drew Endy. I'm going to tell you who they are when they sit down. Matthew Liao and Greg Kaebnick. Okay. So I tweeted last night that this was going to be the best panel at the World Science Festival, and I really meant it. I agreed to moderate this panel when things were just beginning to get kind of interesting between two of our panelists, George and Drew. And they got even really more interesting just in the last couple of days. So actually, can you put the image on the screen that I had asked for? So this is a picture that Drew, that's Drew with long hair, right? When was this picture taken, Drew?
Oh, a few years ago.
Okay.
So one
Drew,
haircut ago.
Yeah. That's right.
If you don't know from your programs, I mean, you can look at their bios, but Drew is a professor at Stanford. He's a professor of bioengineering. He's been really instrumental in forming the whole idea of synthetic biology, of creating DNA from scratch. And I just want to actually ask, I just want to get a sense of the room, like who here knows what synthetic biology even is? Because it's a weird term. Okay, so a lot of people, but sort of so. Okay, George also is a pioneer in this field and in other fields. And Matthew Liao is a bioethicist here at NYU. And Greg Kaebnick is a bioethicist at the Hastings Center. So these guys have thought a lot about what it means, like what the big questions are in terms of how we should be, if we should be and how we should be altering humanity, which these guys are like starting to allow us to do. But so just to give a quick background of very recent history, which happened after this picture. This picture was taken so you can see that. So Drew sent me this picture by email last night because we were having a short discussion about how we would run this panel. And I was saying, I think it's going to be a really kind of lively panel because George and Drew have been kind of sparring in public. And I was actually like slightly nervous. I wrote the email yesterday afternoon thinking like, I hope you guys are actually going to both come to the panel because George has proposed. George, why don't you just tell us really quickly what you've proposed? So 2 days ago, I think the paper came out 2 days ago, right? You've proposed this big project, and just tell us what you're planning to do.
So what the project is sort of depends on which of my co-organizers you talk to. So I get to present the minority view. But it's inspired by some previous projects to, for example, bring down the cost of reading the human genome. And this one would be an effort to reading not just the human genome, but all sorts of genomes of all sorts of organisms. And this was a proposal to do a similar thing, bring down the cost and come up with research and potential health and other agricultural consequences, applications, and also have an ethics framework. That was what was proposed in the article a couple days ago.
But say it in the most sexy way. I mean, what he's talking about is he's proposing to create a human genome from scratch.
In cells.
In cells.
You want it even sexier than it actually is.
In cells, which would then have the capacity, but it doesn't. It wouldn't necessarily stay in cells, right? I mean, your proposal is to do it in cells.
Yeah.
Let's be fair about that. But the idea.
You cannot, when you put on your ethics hat, you cannot be immune to or ignore projects around the main project that we all worry about, like getting germline modification of human beings.
In other words, like creating babies that don't have biological parents because they are created from scratch because because these guys are giving us the tools to write DNA and create a complete set of chromosomes that would make up a human being, right? I mean, ultimately that could happen.
It's a related topic, yeah.
Okay. Greg, you're
Well,
going to.
I would love to know right off the bat in what sense this is the minority view.
Well, I don't want to, name names and deviate too much. But I think in the end we produced a consensus work, and I've been a co-author on papers that have had more listed authors, but I've never been on a paper that had more actual authors that micromanaged the writing, including editors and people outside the project. I think the consensus is that we want it to be improve the technology, focus on all sorts of genomes, including agricultural ones and so forth, but not to ignore the ethical, legal, social components, which would include things that are outside the project.
But it's because I feel like there's a lot at this festival that tells us, amazing things about astrophysics and like where we are, our place in the universe. But this panel, and it tells us about what science can tell us, and not much of it is contested. I mean, science is telling us stuff, and we're learning about it, and it's really cool. But what George is talking about doing, and I think what Drew is talking about doing, but maybe in a slightly different way, is a highly contested thing about, and it makes us think about, it makes us, go introspective and think about who we are as humans, what it means to be human, what we want it to mean to be human, and we all have a huge stake in it, and it hasn't happened yet quite, and maybe if we talk about it enough, we'll all be able to influence its future. But that is kind of where Drew comes in. So I'm still giving you the 2-minute synopsis of very recent history, which is that George proposed this. He helped to organize a meeting a month ago or so, maybe 6 weeks ago.
May 10th at Harvard,
and it was a closed meeting, so there were apparently reporters. I was not invited. There were other reporters there, but reporters were told not to report on it, and the attendees were told not to talk about it because they were waiting for this paper to come out. Drew took exception to that. So Drew, why don't you just fill us in on what happened from your end on that?
Some highlights, for me were, it's great to have academic meetings. They happen all the time. They happen in private. That's very important for a number of reasons. But it wasn't just an academic meeting. It was an academic meeting that was coupled to other activities, including, as things became apparent, the launching and definition of an organization that was setting out to do the work, to develop the capacities to make real our abilities to construct human genomes in cells. And so, associated with the publication of the paper in Science, there were also other publications, an article online from the chief technology officer of a company, Autodesk, that makes software design tools, market cap of about $15 billion. And to a first approximation, I don't have it memorized, the title of his posting is Autodesk is all in on synthesizing genomes, including humans. So, I love academic meetings. I love George. I love all the authors.
No, he does love George.
But wow, I wasn't ready for this. And when I talked to Lori, about what was going on, and said, am I feeling strange in ways that are like, should I just relax a little bit? And her response didn't damp down my unease.
So sorry, because I didn't introduce Lori. Just tell us who
Lori
Lori
Zoloff is a religious scholar and bioethicist based out of Northwestern of some distinction, and for me, the best teacher of ethics I've ever experienced. So for example, I asked Lori to come give a guest lecture once with bioengineering students and synthetic biologists to teach us about ethics, and without telling me anything, the first thing she did was she took a bottle of water as I was sitting before you, and she started pouring it on me, and asked the students, is this ethical, what I am doing? And the answer is it depends. If my hair's on fire, it's a pretty good thing to do. And otherwise, if I don't wish to be drenched, not to. So just a great educator. And she wrote back, and I was like, wow, this is not great. And that's understating it. So Lori and I objected, and tremendous discomfort and things that transpired as a colleague I don't feel proud about. It's not how I'd like to behave. Probably the second most difficult professional situation I've ever been in. never mind the first.
We'll ask you about that later.
Nope. Lori and I did something which was extraordinary for us. We posted a piece as fast as we could through the MIT library, asking this question: should we synthesize a human genome? And I'll tell you flat out what we were most worried about. We were worried that the veneer of peer review associated with an academic group putting forward this, not just as a proposal, really, but a new organization with a leadership structure, with corporate support, made it seem like it would become open season to pursue the doing of this type of work. And that although there may be a well-intentioned group with an open international consortium which has everything I'm in favor of, I don't have any reason to believe they'll become the only group, that group will stay together, and so on and so forth. So I just acted and triggered all sorts of feelings and emotions and discomfort.
Okay, so that happened. That happened, and then I got signed up to moderate this panel. They said, "Oh, well, Drew, Endy, and George Church are going to come, and we'll have good bioethicists to tell us, how they think about it." And I really want to draw you out because our two bioethicists actually have very different opinions also on this thing. But then the paper came out, and that didn't. I actually thought, so when Drew put this out, a lot of his objection, right, a lot of your objection that I understood, Drew, was about the nature, the process. Like you didn't want it, it was such an important thing, the idea that it could even be closed, even just for, sort of the formality's sake of an embargo for a paper, which isn't that actually unusual. We can argue about whether science should ever be closed, but it often is for periods of time. But then the paper came out and you still objected, right? So I actually really I want to make sure that I understand what of your objection is to the process, and you're just saying, well, we need to have more debate, and what part of your objection is to the actual project.
Oh, well, maybe this is surprising. So definitely some concerns around process because how that impacts practice. But if you were to put me in a different corner with a different hat on, you'd find me to probably be one of the most fanatical proponents of the project.
Okay.
So it's odd to be in a different situation. I care very much about the work. I care very much about seeing it flourish, but done in a way that works well enough, pretty good for most. And I realize that's complicated and
that
may
is
not
complicated.
seem
Okay.
consistent, but here we are.
Okay, sure. So then what do you want to have happen, Drew? What at this point? I mean, do you think that...
So Lori and I have an opinion that there should be independent events, not led by the group organizing the proposal, that should consider various aspects of what's being proposed and take at face value not the important and immediate things that should be done, but let's just presume this succeeds and there's now a platform on our planet for constructing human genomes inside cells. I'm just going to presume that succeeds, and it's going to succeed more than once, and it's important for that to come about. So how do we frame the limits around that, and should there be any limits around it? And right now, it's an odd situation. I'm curious what George and others think very much. It seems like the proposal is we're operating within the existing framework of doing good, of ethics, and we'll figure it out as we go along. And that's very reasonable. Unless there's some things which are actually new that haven't been given time to be considered. And if you go to market as things are now proceeding in a way that leads to unfettered competition, you won't have a chance to have that conversation. So we're talking about something that within the community of people who practice this type of work, although these ideas have been around for over a decade, they've never been organized in a way leading to action before, and all of this is played out in of order less than 6 months, of order 6 months, which fast. in many respects. Very entrepreneurial, a lot to like about that. But okay, so the specific thing, as best Laurie and I can figure it out, and this is all work in progress, we'd like to see, for example, the American Anthropological Association, the Society of Religious Scholars and Bioethics, have an independent meeting to be best informed by the science, and to deliberate and report back, and to get a better sense of things. We'd like to see there be more diverse debate around the merits of the investment in the technology itself, so that if such a large investment were to go forward, it doesn't lead us down a path that selects for particular technologies that are maybe not the best ones we could deliver in their type, right? So for example, the Human Genome Sequencing Project is great, but the sequencing technology that got delivered was biased towards cost down, and other parameters, as opposed to allowing individuals to do a great job by themselves sequencing. And I think that same type of play might reoccur I'm certain some of those biases will reoccur however we frame things with synthesis technology.
So George, I want to ask you to respond to that, but first I want to ask you something else, and then, which is why. So Drew mentioned it in passing that these ideas have been around for a decade or more, right? So why now? Why did this proposal come up now? Is it a matter of cost? Did something happen with the science that suddenly you're able to do it? Why? I mean, we have this one project that I know of, and you can fill me in on others, but to synthesize the yeast genome, which is, maybe you can explain what the yeast genome is, because it's much smaller or less complicated than a human genome, and that's as far as I understand we've gotten. So why now? Why do you think this is the right time for this?
Well, it's kind of like, why did we start the Human Genome Read project in 1984, or the Brain Initiative, or the National Microbiome Initiative, and so forth? All these initiatives. Part of it is Washington has initiative fever, is one thing. Mm-hmm. Another thing is we do have at least 3 big projects where we're getting momentum on synthesizing whole genomes. One was the one you mentioned in yeast, which is about 300 times smaller than human, which, just to put that in perspective, we're seeing exponential improvements in technology which are on the order of 3 million-fold. So 300-fold is not asking for much. Used to be, but not so much anymore. So as part of it is this realization of these exponentials. And to some extent, you want to get ahead of it, just as Drew is saying. We want to anticipate the next few moves. We want to assume that X is going to succeed, and then where do we go next? And so if anything, we were taking too small a step. Drew was taking the correct, longer step to think it through before we make some irreversible mistake. I completely agree with what he's saying there. And so there isn't a rush per se. It's not like we're dealing with Zika virus or something like that. We're dealing with an exponential. It's a steady exponential, but it's very, very fast. It's faster than electronics. So anyway, the three projects are the yeast project and then 2 bacterial projects, which are a little bit smaller, but some of them are moving to fairly radical changes in the genome, not just making a copy of it. Okay.
But before we even get into the idea of a human genome, I mean, why make such a huge leap? Why make yeast? So maybe explain to people what yeast even. Do you know yeast? Why would we even be talking about yeast?
Okay. So I'll talk about yeast and E. coli. So yeast and E. coli are industrial organisms. Yeast is used in beer and wine and bread, and E. coli is used in manufacturing plastic precursors and pharmaceuticals and so forth. And I think E. coli is the better example because it has a problem, which is it gets infected with viruses. And so one of the things that we've done is we've recoded the E. coli genome. Recoding means changed all the proteins so that they now have a new genetic code, so that now the organism can be resistant to viruses. That would have advantages if we did that for mammalian cells, humans or other mammalian cells that are used in other kinds of biomanufacturing for vaccines and protein pharmaceuticals, antibodies, and so forth, to keep them from getting the factories from getting contaminated, which can reduce productivity for a couple of years. So what's new, and the reason that we would be doing it now, is we've just demonstrated that we can get multivirus resistance by doing a genome-wide engineering of a microbe that's used industrially, could we do the same thing, genome-wide engineering of a human cell that's used in manufacturing?
So the idea is that you could have a human cell so that I would never get a cold, or I would not be vulnerable to a virus. to any
No,
virus.
so there's a second application. So that's one application is there's a factory, we have stainless steel fermenters, and you're cranking out an orphan drug, say, a protein from human that you would get injected with if you had a genetic disease. Another one is you might get a stem cell therapy, and we'd like those stem cells to be as safe as possible. We want them to be virus resistant, cancer resistant, and so forth. If we're going to be transplanting those into your body, we'd like them to be as safe as possible, and that might benefit from a much more comprehensive multigenic approach than we currently have, which is really one gene at a time, maybe two.
Okay. All right. I want to ask you guys, I wanted to jump in. And Greg, so I know you've thought a lot about synthetic biology, just the sort of the idea of, sort of specifics about what you might want to invent if you could actually write your own code, but also just the idea of, of that creation. I mean, is there a moral line to be drawn about somewhere about what we want to create a human genome?
And near term, I find that I'm almost on the permissive side of Drew. In a way, I am a little bit less concerned about the proposal that's right in front of us than Drew seems to be.
That's unusual.
And that's very unusual for me. It's a surprising situation for me to find myself in, and I've been wondering exactly why that would be, and I have some ideas about it. But then there are these way down the road questions about what we might be able to do if we really got to the point that we're not talking just about creating a synthetic human genome in a cell, maybe even just a somatic cell, but actually, bringing people to life whose genomes we have synthesized. It gives us potentially a capacity to control the nature of these individuals. You began to gesture at this when you talked about the prospect of creating humans who are resistant to viral infection and resistant to cancer development. We would have a capacity to begin to try to make people turn out the way we want. Now, there's a whole nother set of questions about whether we really know enough about what the genes actually do that we would really have that kind of control. It's one thing to have tools for editing, like we have with CRISPR, and it's another thing to be able to synthesize a whole genome. But that doesn't mean that the being we're creating would really turn out to be the way we want, given the tremendous influence of the environment and what have you. Nonetheless, that kind of desire for control, and I think we're talking at this point decades since, but that kind of desire I do find troubling.
Okay. And Drew, you're shaking your head at the idea of, are you shaking your head at decades hence? I mean, do you think
Well, this is where the
than
difference
we-
probably is. I don't know what your best idea is, but I suspect the difference between us is what you mean by way down the road. Gretzky, the hockey player, when asked to explain why he was a good hockey player, quipped, "I skate to where the puck is going to be." And even in ice hockey, there's friction, and so the puck is decelerating. We've got the opposite situation, right? We have a puck with a little rocket on it, and it's going faster and faster and faster. And it's very, very hard. Like, George is one of the best people in the world in making sense of these types of trends. I call surfing exponential. And when I first started teaching, the cost of building DNA that was 4,000 bases long cost me $4 a base. And last year it was 4 cents a base. And this coming week it'll be 1.5 pennies a base. And the runway around that cost down doesn't seem to dry up in the next 5 to 10 years, based on what I think we see before us. So I think there may be a point of difference regarding what way down the road means. And I'll add into the conversation, ideas like Hank Greeley, of all people, putting forward in his book, The End of Sex,
Hank really is a bioethicist at
right,
Stanford.
and law professor, where basically the idea would be you go from a cell isolated from a person and then can redevelop that and eventually produce a zygote. And so a cell line all of a sudden becomes an interesting venue within which to establish the capacity to make a genome. Just reading Hank's book, I didn't think too much of it, but when I talked to Dave Baltimore about it 2 days ago, a biologist at Caltech, I thought it seemed pretty reasonable. So if it felt like this wasn't screaming along into some space of unfettered entrepreneurial competition, whatever. If you want to, I wouldn't care. If you want to have a private meeting to design the next quad on your campus, I don't care. But the human genome is special to me, and it's the thing that connects us. And I can imagine a future where we're going full on doing this for the purpose of establishing the next generations for good reasons. And I really, to be careful, don't want any of that to get in the way of doing the things that would be helpful right now. So I appreciate your being on the permissive side of that very much. But I sometimes, I'm in the business of living backwards from the future, and I think that future is not way down the road.
So this whole business about signing on, caring about the human genome down the road, I'm totally on board with that. It's the degree to which the train is speeding up. And it seems to me that where it's really speeding up is in the capacity to edit and synthesize, our ability to understand what genes do what to contribute to what traits is not going, it's not speeding up at that same.
But it's not zero.
It's not zero. You're right about that.
Let me ask Matthew where you fall in this spectrum of permissive to non-permissive, and what concerns, because you had a fascinating paper, I thought, a few years ago in which you talked about how we might edit the human genome. Right now we're talking about creating human genomes from scratch. There's a whole other area of controversy, which sounded really controversial before 2 minutes ago when we started talking about creating it from scratch, which is editing. So we now have the capacity to edit genomes in general in a much easier way and faster way and more precise way than we ever have had before. George's point is that you can only go so far with editing. I'm paraphrasing you, but so if we're going to bother doing all these edits to sort of try to make our children or ourselves free of disease or better in some way, why not just do it? It's easier to do it from scratch. But Matthew's paper really was about what we might want to do to make ourselves, how we might ethically edit ourselves for climate change, for example. So I'm really curious to hear where you take all of this.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm probably more on the more permissive side of this whole spectrum. I think that I agree with everybody here that in the near term, the research should go forward. I don't see much of a big problem with sort of synthesizing yeast, genomes and or studying sort of aspects of the human genome. And so, but I leave it to the scientists to decide how quickly we're going to arrive at the end station, which is sort of the possibility of creating synthetic humans. And on that issue, bioethicists differ. So Greg's more on the side where people are worried. They think that this might be sort of over-controlling of our human nature. I'm more on the side, and they're on the other side of the spectrum. There are people who think we should go forward. Anything goes. People should have the liberty to be able to, create whatever kind of human beings or even human animal chimera that they want, et cetera, et cetera. My view is that what we need is a really robust ethical framework. And within this robust ethical framework, I think there's a way going forward where we can do this ethically. So I'll briefly sketch that. So I think that ethical framework, two very simple assumptions. So one is that all human beings have the same equal moral status. We're all equal. Right? So it doesn't matter if you're an adult or a child. It doesn't matter if you're smart or what your IQ is. It doesn't matter if you're disabled or you're you're unconscious. We have the same equal moral status. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that human beings have this is something that I've developed elsewhere. It's the human have the human right to what I call the fundamental capacities for pursuing a good life. Now that's kind of complicated, but it's the basic idea is that we all need certain capacities, goods, and things that whatever else we might need as human beings in order to pursue the good life. So take capacities, for example. We need the ability to be able to think, to be able to act, to be able to interact with other people, to have interpersonal relationships, to be able to think in a moral, sort of moral kind of way, and so on. Okay, so those two assumptions, I think, give us a framework for thinking about designer humans. So what it tells us, one thing, is that we shouldn't create human beings who are not going to have all the fundamental capacities, right? So, for example, if you can create a human being with Tay-Sachs, so that's a single genetic disorder, and it's very debilitating. The child sort of dies at a very early age. We shouldn't do that, even if you can deliberately create human, once we have the ability. So the ethical framework tells us that we shouldn't do that. Okay. At the same time, if you can, suppose that there's someone that doesn't have all the fundamental capacities, is already on the way, or has already been created, it's on the way. What this framework tells us is that you don't have to. You can sort of continue to bring this child to term. You don't have to abort it, for example. So this applies, for example, to Down syndrome children, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason is that all human beings have equal moral status. So this child has the same moral status as everybody else. And the analogy is roughly something like this, right? So imagine that you're building a house, right? When you're trying to build a house, obviously what you should do is you should try to make sure that the fundamental structures are all there, right? The water piping, the electrical wiring, and so on, right? But suppose that you start building a house already, and you find that you forgot the water piping. Water piping is missing, right? It doesn't mean that you have to tear the whole house down. There may be enough of other fundamental things in there such that you don't have to tear the thing down. Maybe you can augment it in some other ways, put the wider piping on the outside, et cetera, et cetera. So that's roughly the analogy. And then the third thing that I'll say is that some people think that we have a moral obligation to create the best child possible. And this, some people think about, eugenics, they worry about genetics. I don't think, so on this framework, we don't have an obligation to create the best child with the best life possible, right? So on that framework, on the view where you have to create the best child possible, say you're in China and it's having the best life possible is to be male, that view says you got a moral obligation to create male children. But this view doesn't say that. It says that, look, as long as you have the fundamental capacities, and men and women can have all the fundamental capacities, it doesn't require you to create male babies versus female babies. Okay, so that's another difference. And then the last thing I'll say is just the human engineering. I think that with this with this ability to synthesize human genome, we can actually do a lot of things. So a lot of people are worried about, when they talk about moral enhancements, they're worried about they see it as a zero-sum game, right? If somebody is smarter, then that's going to hurt my child or something like that. But there's actually a lot of opportunities for this to solve big world problems. So one thing is the climate change. And there, I'll just use, climate change is a really big problem. We don't really know how to solve it. But it turns out that we can use human engineering to help us address climate change. So I'll give two examples. So one is that people eat too much meat, right? And if they were to cut down on their consumption of meat, then it would actually really help the planet. But people are not willing to give up meat. Yeah, some people will be willing to, but other people, they may be willing to, but they have a weakness of will. They say, wow, this steak is just too juicy. I can't do it. I'm one of those, by the way. So, so here's the thought, right? So it turns out that we know a lot about, we have these intolerance to, for example, I have milk intolerance, and some people are intolerant to crayfish. So possibly we can use human engineering to make it the case that we're intolerant to certain kinds of meat, to certain kinds of bovine proteins. And there's actually analogs of this in life. There's this thing called the long-star tick, where if it bites you, you will become allergic to meat. I can sort of describe the mechanism. So that's something that we can do through human engineering. We can kind of possibly address really big world problems through human engineering. Another example is, and
You go first.
yeah, and another example is sort of, and here I'll go first, right? You'll see that I'm the smallest person here, right? And Amy's the smallest person. So it turns out that the larger you are, think of the lifetime sort of greenhouse gas emissions that are required to sort of, the energy that's required to transport larger people rather than smaller people, right? But if we're smaller just by 15 centimeters, right, that's a mass, I did the math, and it's about mass reduction of 25%, which is huge. And 100 years ago, we're all on the average smaller, exactly about 15 centimeters smaller, right? So think of just the, like lifetime greenhouse gas emissions if we had smaller children, right? And so that's something that we could do through some sort of human
could we, like setting aside, should we? For a second, let's just set that
Sounds
aside.
like there's a Randy Newman song in here somewhere.
But I mean, is that could we actually, is that crazy? I'm going to ask Drew.
Well, how small should we go?
We shouldn't be so small that we get eaten by cats, right? That's clear. But just sort of rolling back 100 years, right? So, Einstein was pretty small. And so a couple of things, like how many like centurions do you see that are over certain height, right? Like they tend to be smaller, right? And the other thing is,
People
if you
who
want
live a long time, you mean?
Yeah, people who live a very long time. And the other thing is, we want to colonize space. It's much better to have, think of how much fuel and food and et cetera, to transport bigger person.
So if I'm an entrepreneur right now, this is great. I can go raise $1 billion to start a company to synthesize human genomes because there's $1 trillion market opportunities, and you're just rattling them off. And wow, what a
Okay.
great Series A that's going to be.
So Drew, we're back to the question, and I really do want to pose it to you, George. Why not talk about this a little more first? Just as soon as you start talking about it, things get kind of out of crazy. So why didn't
Well, we are talking about it.
Well, we were talking about it, but you have already made it clear that you're going to, you have said you're going ahead and raising money and doing it.
Well, actually, full disclosure, I've been doing this since 2009, building human genomes. Part of the reason we developed the CRISPR is because we had an NIH grant to engineer human genomes in cells and turn those into organs, right? So we've been doing it. The question is, what does first mean, right? We've been talking about germline modification for longer than we've been doing CRISPR. It comes up again when
Let's just explain what germline modification is, and just really.
It's essentially what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Is changing not just our bodies, which is gene therapy, our adult bodies, but changing the inheritance of that. So we essentially do gene therapy on ourselves and our children and our grandchildren.
So it gets passed down. So you can make a change in an embryo, and that embryo will grow up to have the trait that you changed, and then pass it down to his or her offspring.
And this has already been done as well. So we're doing it first, in that we're doing it constantly, having these ethical conversations. We're also constantly practicing what we claim to be as in the future. So there are dozens of children that are now teenagers that have had gene therapy on their germline in the form of mitochondrial transfer, where they had their mother had a damaged mitochondria. And
Mitochondria
is the powerhouse of cells and inherited through your mother, and it's the only germline therapy that's been tested. And some people consider it exceptional. I consider it just another chromosome, but in any case, it's past tense. We've done it. Mm-hmm. So we are talking about it first before we do something else, but we're also talking about it later than a lot of things we've already done.
Well, Drew, is that true? George is saying, what's your problem? We've been talking about it since 2000. We've been doing it since 2009. We've been talking about it all along. Why make such a fuss?
Yeah, and to acknowledge, right, other things happening. Standard of care in Palo Alto Children's Hospital is the fetus in utero is approximately sequenced, right, from a blood draw of the expectant mom, and that gives you about 1,000 genetic data points, and You get to make go, no-go decisions on that basis. And that was not standard of care 3 years ago, and it's standard of care today. And so, just let's admit to that. Let's take what's being proposed and just explore it a little bit more. So, do I need to have parents? Right now I do. Do I need to be a human? Right now I do. Do I care about things staying together as a species? I think so, but there's a lot of baggage with the whole species concept. When Ursula Le Guin writes her essay, she unnames them, and Eve throughout the garden removes all the species names so that the yaks are no longer known for being yaks, but they're just Sue or Bob or George. So some of this, I'll admit, gets to the fantastic. But I think the primary discomfort for me arises with the way this is playing out, such that there's a veneer of some type of acceptability combined with a path that leads to open season entrepreneurship. And not that that's bad per se, but when it's coupled to the substrate, which is the human genome, right? And there's all this potential around where that goes and how that's practiced. I think that deserves a pause, not to stop the work in progress, not to slow down on getting better at building DNA. I'm probably like the most fanatical proponent of that, or near fanatical. What Laurie and I are basically saying is, and oh, by the way, the 4 and plus 1, 5 of us on the stage here and in the room don't represent the full plurality of perspectives. Far from it. It's kind of shocking how biased this panel is. What Laurie in particular, I think, represents well, and what we were trying to bring forward in our essay, is that the diversity of voices who might need to be heard before this becomes real, whether it's a long way down the road or not. Wow, we're really talking about it in an unrestrained way suddenly. I come from a family where some of my relatives, as George knows, start conversations with me by asking what's wrong with the DNA that God gave us. Right?
Okay.
So anyway,
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think Drew's raising a really good point about sort of where does this go and how is it going to affect human nature. And so I think there we need to think more. So what is special about human nature? And some people want to say there's just nothing special. Other people say, we're made in God's image, right? I've argued that what's special about human nature is that, and this is my own view, is that we have this genetic basis for moral agency. What that means is we got the genes we have the capacity to be able to act morally. Okay, it's a very Kantian view. And so that also tells us something about this whole genetic modification, right? If you're so creating yeast is one thing, creating humans is another thing. But if you start mixing, right, like human animal chimeras, like there's a question of like, where does that, if you can create from scratch. What it tells you is that maybe what we shouldn't do is interfere with the capacity for moral agency. And that if we don't do that, that might be able to set some sort of lower threshold limit. So, but I'm just throwing that out there, not to say that it's right, but to say we need to push now. I think Drew's raising a really good question, but we shouldn't avoid it. It's going to happen. So we need to push forward and come up with argument, try to think clearly, stare at the problem clearly and sort of say, well, where are the constraints? Are there any limits? Where's the limit? And I think there is a limit, and the limit is on this moral agency. But that's my view.
Greg, where's your limit?
Yeah.
First I want to say, I think it's there's sort of two parts to Matthew's proposal. There's this, think about human enhancement tethered to some understanding of human capacities. Yeah. So it's actually a rather moderate view about human enhancement in the literature. Yeah. The folks who are known as transhumanists don't want to be tethered to some of the capacities that Matthew is endorsing, like things like sociality and emotionality. Okay. Those are important parts of our human nature in this theory, And the transhumanists might be very, very happy to jettison that. So already he's proposing some rather significant constraints, in spite of the kind of the wilder part at the end where he talks about breeding Chihuahua-sized people in order to survive. And ever
5 feet 5.
5 feet 5. Okay. There's so much to say here. I love the emphasis on public deliberation that Drew is calling for. I think that just as the science has actually already been proceeding, there's a sense in which the public deliberation has already been proceeding. We've been thinking about some of these issues for quite a while. What's proposed here, if we were to synthesize an entire genome and stick it into an egg, is essentially very similar to the debate that we have had about cloning. So this has been part of our cultural conversation, but the problem is that it hasn't been the conversation hasn't been structured in a way that gives it real bite and gives you an assurance that everyone's voice has been represented. What we have are academies, commissions, and House testimony, and sort of and the New York Times offering stories, and so there's conversation and movies. There's conversation going on, but it's not clear that it's the kind that can actually make sure that Matthew's rather limited understanding would be followed. I mean, Drew's concerned that what gives us the confidence that we would stick to the basic human capacities when we begin to enhance people. And so for me, I want to endorse Drew's call for public deliberation, and the real issue is how do you actually do that in a way that really means something? And it sounds like you and Laurie have actually, you're wrestling with that and really.
I would say we're struggling with it.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is a fascinating question. I want to just ask Drew, and Drew may have to leave for a plane, so I want to be sure to nail you down on this before you actually have to go. But you, so everyone, I think, including George, respects the idea that we should be talking about it more, right? I mean, to the degree that you've been painted as somebody who doesn't want to talk about it, I don't, that
I definitely want to talk about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we all want to talk about it. And Drew, and you have been like leading this call to talk about it. But I mean, do you have an answer? What you have also thought it through so much, and you've been called. There was a phrase that I came across, and someone who is generally opposed to modification of anything, food, crops, whatever, called you the alpha synthusiast. For synthetic.
That sounds like Jim Thomas.
I think it was Jim Thomas from the group ETC.
Right.
If I'm not. But so you are interested in making weird new things from DNA, as I understand it. so where do you draw?
Weird's not a pejorative.
No, I don't say it pejoratively. But tell us what you are interested in and where you think the lines should be drawn. Since you,
I don't know. So here's what I can offer. So I'm learning in part through Twitter. Get questions from George through Twitter. This is great. But I posed a question on Twitter, like, should we synthesize a human genome? And I got some responses from people I didn't know, and they fall into a couple different categories. One was yes. The second was where would we draw the line? The third was doesn't matter. You don't need to ask the question. Craig, as in Craig Venter, or the Chinese will do it regardless. Right? This is all moot.
Craig Venter is another biologist who's been working on synthetic biology for a while.
And the fourth is stop trying to get attention for yourself. You suck. So for me personally, the point of comfort, I actually don't have the expertise or perspective of my two colleagues and any of my colleagues here. The point for me that I get to right now that I'd offer is I'd feel excited and comfortable about synthesizing the human genome associated with my lineage and other people doing the same when I have a sense of the sacred in the realm of the digital. So if I'm looking at the sequence information of a human genome on a computer, or whatever the computer is way down the road in 10 years, do I feel the same way about that information represented in the abstract as I do about my 3-year-old boy or the boy expected in a month, right? So if I had, which is why I'm going to have to leave early. So if the traffic's bad. So that's one condition. And then I think there's another condition, for me, again, it's just my opinion, which I'd like to see satisfied first. I think there is an immense amount of ego in this conversation associated with being human. And we're on this planet with a whole bunch of other types of biology. And I think through synthetic biology, this is easy to overlook, we can actually, it's one thing to focus on ourselves and what it might mean to change ourselves, but we can change our relationship with the rest of the planet. There's a sufficient capacity for making things via biology to provide both for humanity and for nature. We should be able to get to living with Earth, not just living on Earth. And so if those two things were true, if I had a sense of the sacred in the realm of the digital, and if humanity was flourishing in partnership with nature, I'd have the type of comfort that we could live up to these ideals of equality, of opportunity, of morality. But our whole framework of our civilization right now is not operating on this basis. We have power relations and economic structures that depend on scarcity, right, and inequity, and I'm not trying to be a naive optimist about this. I'm trying to do back the envelope calculations around just the physics of how things are working on our planet. We've got approximately 90 terawatts of power through photosynthesis in biology, which is about 4 to 5 times more than what civilization consumes. And so in any case, that's just me, and I'd like to hear a lot of other perspectives. I think, again, recognize one of the failure modes around biotechnology and genetic engineering and whatnot is products get shipped and we make the mistake of expecting everybody should have the same opinion of it. It's like going to the museum and you see this nice painting and I expect we all have the same interpretation or perspective on the work of art. That's crazy. We don't expect that when we go to the museum. But for some reason, I think it's just our culture, meaning how we as a society interact with biotechnology is still so immature that we make the mistake of not accepting plurality of perspectives oftentimes when we look at the works. And so, in any case, am I being responsive to your question?
Yes, but can you say one thing about what you actually would want to see? I mean, you've talked eloquently about what you want to see happen first before we go to creating humans.
Right.
Is there some interim step that you're enthusiastic about? Now?
I'd like to have tomorrow. Actually, later today would be fine as well. I'd like to have a personal DNA printer. I don't care if it comes from Apple or somebody else. Just iDNA. It's my personal DNA printer that makes 10,000 base pairs of DNA a minute or a second, because approximately everybody I know would use that right away as a biologist or biotechnologist.
Everybody, how would they use it? Because
let's say you actually want to design and synthesize DNA. You have to get that DNA from somewhere. And one of the best places to get it is a company George and I co-founded. I won't advertise the company, but to give you a sense of that transaction is you place an order and then weeks go by, and with some reasonably high reliability now, you'll get your DNA back. You have other ways of doing that transaction that can be faster and more expensive, but that's basically it. And so if I want to do something to discover how the biology works or to make something new to solve a problem, at some point I have to make the DNA that encodes the thing I'm trying to realize, and I've got significant latency in that turnaround, right? Once I've figured out what I wanted, it takes me a long time to get it back. Imagine if you were learning how to program a computer and you didn't have, it used to be like this. You didn't have real-time compilers and debuggers, right? Think about how much longer it would take you to learn how to program computers. If you give me a real-time compiler for DNA, then I'm going to learn about the biology a lot faster.
So one analysis, or some analyses I've seen of the project HGP, it's HGP Write is the name of the project, Human Genome Project Write, as in like you're writing the DNA rather than reading the DNA, do you have to go? Okay, go. Okay, say goodbye to Drew. We're going to have questions. Thank you. Good. But this is a question for you, George, is that part of the idea is to drive down the cost of just what Drew was talking about. He wants to get that cheap DNA to be synthetic DNA to be ready whenever he needs it. I mean, is that one of your goals?
Absolutely, it's one of the goals of the project. And getting back to some of the points earlier about understanding, it's also to drive understanding in that it's hard to understand things just by watching them. I mean, you get some, but if you can change one thing, you can get at causality. If you can change one thing millions of times, meaning millions of things, one at a time, you can test causality. This particular mutation, which we're seeing in the clinic, is benign. This other one that we're seeing in the clinic is very scary, right? And we can find out what that is, because the differences between us is 3 million differences, and some of those are some of those are just completely neutral. So we want to just decrease the cost of synthesis, getting it into cells and testing it. That's the key point, and testing it. All of those can be brought down in price in a variety of ways.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you when Drew was here, but I do want to sort of ask you. I mean, do you not have any of the same qualms that he is voicing in terms of
Me?
you? Yes. I mean,
I have way more qualms than he has.
All right, let's hear them. What are your qualms? What should we be concerned about as you go forward and do this?
Well, I mean, it's starting in 2004, which is even further back than 2009. I raised the issue. We were publishing our first paper on synthesizing DNA from chips, which brought the price down 1,000-fold. And I suddenly realized that people could synthesize pathogens. 2004. And so but it's not sufficient to say, should we? I knew we shouldn't make pathogens freely available to teenagers, just by having their desktop printer that Drew wants so much. I have qualms about Drew having a desktop printer, or my granddaughter. So I propose that there be surveillance. It's not sufficient that everybody says, "Oh, I promise to be a good boy or girl." You have to have surveillance, and I think, and there are things like that. I am not at all worried about the discrimination against tall people. That's absolutely fine with me. I wish I were much smaller. I think. But anyway, the list goes on.
Well,
I mean, I don't want to take up all the time with all my qualms, but.
Well, I mean, but what should the safeguards be as you go forward?
Well, so I gave an example where the safeguards are surveillance to make sure that we know what everybody is doing. That actually, since 2004, it was a bit of a struggle when I proposed it to government agencies and CEOs of companies. I got pushback, which was, this is not a good idea because it makes us liable. If we're searching for smallpox and we don't see it, it's there in the order. Somebody ordered smallpox and we don't see it, then something bad happens. Then we're liable. While if we have a policy of never looking, it's not a problem.
So surveillance, you mean from companies, surveilling the companies that people are ordering DNA from are responsible for it?
Yeah, and if they make a desktop printer, then they have to ensure that desktop printer is just as responsible as the companies are now. So there now is some international agreement that the companies should do surveillance despite the original legal pushback. But if you start making desktop printers, you have to make sure that they phone home to say, hey, Drew just ordered smallpox. Is that okay? And then if you disable the chip,
not here to defend himself. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. My granddaughter just ordered smallpox, and is that okay? And if you take the chip out that phones home, you want to disable the printer so it can't print, right? And so all these things go way beyond should we. There are scenarios where we're pretty sure we shouldn't, but how do you actually implement that? And then you need to lay out a roadmap, and I think that's where Drew was on target, is did we go far enough in laying out a roadmap? When we start talking about our ability to make big changes, and in fact, I do think things are even closer than Drew thinks they are. So for example, you raised the point of these complex things that we can't sort out. There are lots of complex things that we can sort out, so we know how to make a human being who's augmented so that they're resistant to viruses. I mean, a much less complicated the way I described, which is you change the whole coding of the whole genome. You can just knock out the CCR5 gene and they're resistant to HIV. You knock out the FUT2 gene and they're resistant to norovirus. And you go down the list. This is dramatic augmentation that gives them an unfair advantage over other people. So I really think that this is very close, and my qualms have no limit. But that doesn't. But the point is, you don't just say, "Oh, all is lost. Let's just give up." You come up with a roadmap for how you will actually contain it. Not only get people of goodwill to do the right thing, but get people who are not necessarily on board to be constrained as well.
All right. I want to make sure I can open it up to questions, but do you want to respond to anything that he just
Well,
said?
it's a tiny point. When I talk about how little we know about the human genome and what traits do what, I don't so much mean the health conditions that you have in mind, but I mean the genetic contribution to the really interesting behavioral traits that people mostly have in mind when they talk about human enhancement. So, cognitive enhancement.
Well, I can
or
address that,
moral
but I'll
enhancement,
let you have your. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I'm the philosopher here, so I recognize I don't speak with a whole lot of credibility on this, but my feeling is that, from what I gather from the behavioral geneticists I talk to sometimes, is that we know there's a very significant genetic contribution to intelligence, and we know that there are a lot of genes that contribute, but the contribution tends to be, in the single percentages and smaller, and actually figuring out how to fiddle with those in a way that will turn out to be safe and achieve some sort of enhancement. That is the part that I think that is way down the road. But
So just I think this is a very important point. What if that were false reassurance? What if, to some extent, I hear that story a lot too, and it's presented often as we don't need to worry about it because it's so complicated. No bad actors are going to be doing this in the next decade or two or three. Right. What if it weren't that? So here's an example. There are several genes which singly and in combination have been shown in mice to greatly augment their behavioral and cognitive abilities in standardized tests. Lower anxiety, and there are many standard deviations out, twofold impacts on these tests. Now, we don't know that's going to work in humans, but it's so testable. We're not talking about a 1% effect here. We're talking about 2, 3, 4 folds. Do we really think that nobody's going to test that?
Yeah.
Especially in the climate where we have a huge industry now fighting cognitive decline, where we have an aging population that's taking, more and more resources, and most emotional and economic. There's going to be a lot of research on cognitive enhancement to negate cognitive decline. It won't be considered enhancement. But then, do we really think that none of that's going to actually be enhancement when it's used by people who have no decline? I think that this is not decades off. This could be years off or
point
less.
taken. And I would never say never, particularly in your presence. And that's why Drew's right. We need to have this kind of conversation now. I mean, in a way, that's why I'm here. Because while I think that these kinds of, and this is why I sort of support the proposal while wanting to have the conversation about it. I think that the kinds of changes that would concern me are probably a long ways off, far off enough that we have time to have the conversation. But we don't know that for sure, and we should really start.
But George, you're raising that as an issue, but you're not. I mean, are you talking about making a smarter, stronger
Person?
Yes. Is that what we're really talking about?
Well, no. We're talking. Where we're asking. So, does this fall in the category of making smallpox? Where I think we don't ask the question, should we? We've already decided we should not, and then the question becomes, how do we stop it? And how do we get better at it as a numbers game? This is less clear, I think. If some people would maybe give a well-reasoned argument for why we should not enable, let's say, adults to become smarter. And it gets into this gray zone of what if you have somebody who's undergoing cognitive decline. Does that spill over into young people? Does it spill over into fetuses and germline? I don't think we have a clear roadmap there.
Okay. Okay, with that, I think that's a good place to open it up to questions. I can keep asking questions, but there seem like there are a lot. So there's one back there, green shirt.
So, is this on? Yeah. What about the contribution of genetic diversity? So, like, if we do, as you say, and mutate in the germline of all upcoming humans some surface receptor that makes them shorter, so it's better for the environment, and then like a virus like a zoonoses like hantavirus or something mutates to bind that receptor better. Like diversity in genetics is important, right, to our species and has been.
Is that
I think
question
that's
for-
directed to
Yeah,
you.
so that's a really good question. So we need to, for every modification, genetic or otherwise, that we make, there are unintended consequences. So, when they invented the cars, they thought that only a few people were going to drive, and now that's why we have climate change. And same with computers. The IBM. The person. I think there was a quote saying that the world only needs 4 computers, and that and. Now everybody has an iPhone. So there are definitely unintended consequences. I think our job is to have these type of public deliberation where we really try to think through and try to think about all the known knowns and all the unknown knowns and all the known unknowns. And, it's really trying to figure it out. I don't know. I think we're pretty bad. So here's where I agree with Drew. We should be a bit more cautious because we're really actually pretty bad at predicting what's going to happen. But I don't see any way of going forward. I think once you take the long view, there's a question of human just our species survival, human survival, et cetera, colonization. Like all those will require the type of technologies that George and Drew are working on, and we just need to have much more knowledge. And I feel like the way to go forward is that we do need to proceed cautiously, but we need to stare clearly at the issue. I'll just say one other thing, which is that Drew said something which I thought was really important, which is, we don't want to use these technologies so that we can just sort of gain competitive advantage. Like we need to respect nature, right? And I think that resonates with a lot of people. But notice that when I talk about using human engineering to address climate change, that is trying to address, that is trying to be respectful to nature. I mean, right now we've done all this, we've caused all these destructions, to the planet, and there's a question about how we should go about fixing that. And some people are suggesting that, we should do something called geoengineering, which is this massive modification of the planet, spraying sulfate aerosols into the ozone layer to increase the reflectivity of the planet, or, putting, sort of iron in oceans to increase its carbon sucking ability. Right? But those, you could end up destroying the ozone layer, you could end up destroying the whole marine life in the oceans. Those are huge, massive manipulations. And so, there are 2 equations here, when we're trying to address the climate change problem. There's the environment, which and then there's ourselves. And the thought here is that maybe we should get creative, through these technologies to think about, so, we've been trying to change the environment, and maybe we should also think about, like, changing ourselves, like what can we do to help, have a more sustainable environment. So
I like that basic idea
Yeah.
so much, the idea that we should be changing ourselves.
Yeah.
The idea that we would do it through genetic alterations to our nature seems to me to put it too far off.
Okay. Yeah.
That is my,
yeah.
it seems to me we need to act sooner than that. But
Yeah. So there, that's right. I mean, there are the problem with climate change is that nobody has a solution.
Yeah.
And so we don't know how quickly and we don't know how fast this could be. And so one of the things I've argued is that we need something, what I call win-win solutions, right? So things like cognitive enhancement, it turns out that cognitive enhancement, there's a correlation. This is not causation. There's just a correlation where people, when they tend to be more educated, like in Scandinavian countries, they also tend to have lower birth rates. right? And so if you actually were able to improve cognition, I mean, a lot of people worry about cognitive enhancements because they think, oh, you're going to use that to dominate some other people. But it could also be used for moral purposes, like climate change. You know, if people reduce their birth rates and, you know, like through better education or through cognitive enhancements, that could affect us. And actually, we already have ways of doing that now through things like modafinil, Ritalin, and other sort of psychopharmacological means. But I think that, I mean, you know, so I think there are ways of doing these type of technologies where we can sort of, you know, be more respectful to human nature.
Although I just need to say that I do think there are, I mean, if you're talking about cognitive genetically engineering cognitive enhancements in order to reduce birth rates, it just seems like there's a lot of other things you could do to reduce birth rates that in terms of raising poverty level and making sure that people have.
That's right. But is it, so the question is whether is it a win-win solution? So some people say now, so in the UK, for example, 2 doctors said, look, in response to climate change, we should limit the quota. Everybody should just have 2 children. And there's this philosopher, Sarah Conley, she argues, you know, 1 child, like basically the China's 1-child policy. But notice that those policies are very, they're very liberty restricting, right? You can only have 1 child, right? I mean, some people want to have more. But if you have a policy, if you now can begin to augment humans, like the size of humans, right? And what we care about is just the overall greenhouse gas emissions, let's say, just keep it very simple. We care about the overall output. Now, you can give people a quota, each family per quota, right? So,
certain number of kilograms.
Yeah, so so one family can have you can have 1 large-sized child, or 2 medium-sized children, or 3 smaller child. It's in that context, it's much more liberty enhancing than a policy that says you can only have 1 child.
Just as a really quick note, when you, as a journalist, when I write a science story, I talk to the scientists and they're all like really gung ho about the science, and you know George wants to forge ahead. He does have qualms, but then you call the bioethicist to kind of get the like. You know, the quote that says, you know, we really need to be careful and put the brakes on this. These scientists are crazy, you know. But you're not that kind of you're a different kind of bioethicist.
We have an inversion today.
Yes.
Well, they're
Qualms and
there are 2
kilograms.
types of bioethicists. There's sort of something in the literature. It's called regulatory bioethicists. They sit on IRBs. They're trying to make sure that you know safety is followed. The subjects have been properly consented. And then there's sort of academic bioethicists, and they span a wide spectrum. They're philosophers, anthropologists, religious scholars, and they try to think about they try to take the longer view, sort of what we ought to do. And so there, the opinions vary. So yeah.
Let me make sure. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, where's the microphone? Oh, there. Bring it to the front. I know there are so many questions. Here, right here.
So when I hear discussions like this, I get frustrated because I think, well, how do you get to a go no go decision on things? I spent a couple of days in Washington listening to a lot of talk about risk and biology and risk assessment, and one of the things is what is the end point that you're trying to avoid in a lot of these things? Because you can say, all right, it's lack of genetic diversity, and that's something that you can measure and you can quantitate, and you can talk about how much genetic diversity there is now and what would happen, and you can build models and scenarios. Perhaps they might be really complicated, but some of these fuzzier things, like sort of the loss of the feeling of the sacredness of something, or the loss of the feeling that we're part of one species, or the loss of parents, or the desire to have more than 1 child. Do you think we can ever define a set of endpoints that we all agree on in order to make a go, no-go decision on something like this?
Good question.
Great question.
Just who wants to take that?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. For your proposal may require some go no go decisions. I really liked Drew's line about trying to maintain a sense of the sacred in the realm of the digital, something like that. And that would be, you asked me, Amy, where my limit is, and I kind of dodged it, I think. But I mean, I would want to make sure that as we go forward with enhancement technologies, down the road, 10 years, whatever it turns out to be, that we can do that. And for me, that maintaining a sense of the sacred is going to require a more hands-off attitude than Matthew wants to permit. I want to maintain a sense that my children are a kind of ongoing genetic surprise. I'm willing to enhance them medically, in the medical realm, enhancing them so that they didn't get cancer. I'd have to go along with that. But other kinds of behavioral enhancements, I'd almost rather that they have to sort of struggle with anxieties a little bit and work through them, and turn out the way they're going to turn out. But that does raise this go no go question, and I have struggled myself with this for many, many years, and I've kind of come to the view that these decisions really are fundamentally rather personal decisions. Drew used the word ideal. He has a certain ideal here, and for me, the limits that I want to maintain, which are more stringent than Matthew's, are in a way less stringent in that I want there to remain personal choice here. I want there to be a chance for parents and children to have this kind of relationship of surprise and lack of control, lack of behavioral perfectibility. And as we go forward, I recognize that people will have different views, different sort of aesthetic and moral considerations about this, and Drew sort of gestured at that too. And I just want to make sure that there continues to be room in our society for those of us like me who really don't want to have ever more control. So it's not so much that I want to reach some sort of go no go decision, but I want to reach a space. I want things to turn out so that people can continue to have this sense of their children being unknown gifts.
Okay, go
Can I
ahead.
jump in? Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic to what Greg's saying here. What I want, so first of all, I think that we should have this sort of, we need to be able to draw lines somewhere, between what we want to do and what we don't want to do. And I mentioned this idea about fundamental capacities. So a lot of the fundamental capacities we're going to have to preserve our emotions. We're going to have to preserve our capacity for morality. We're going to, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of like roughly.
Who decides what those fundamental things are?
So we need to have a public debate, but it seems like the capacity for morality seems like a pretty important thing. I mean, you might disagree, in case we can have a little discussion about that, right? Or emotions, et cetera, right? And then then beyond that, I think that, and I'm also, I also believe in this all being voluntary, right? Nobody should be forced. So if Greg doesn't want to do any of this, I think that's his choice, and that's totally fine. If there are other people, it's kind of like some people don't want to carry around smartphones. That's fine, but other people, they want to do various other things, right? And then, but I also think that this whole idea about sacredness, I think that we're going to change. Like if we have expanded capacities, we're going to find other things that are going to be challenging. So right now, for example, intergalactic space travel is a really big challenge, right? How do we get people on Mars? How do we survive on Mars? How do we survive beyond Pluto, et cetera, et cetera? Can we get to, there's all sorts of other things that we can become all about, right? The space, the universe is so big that there are plenty of other opportunities. And it's kind of like, I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, sort of teaching them to play Go Fish, right? Right now, it's really exciting for them to play Go Fish, right? But later on, they're going to find other games much more interesting, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, to sort of right now finding Go Fish to be exciting, but then finding other games to be exciting later on. So
I'm going to take, oh my gosh, everybody wants to ask a question. back there. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, guys. Personally, I think we should go as far as that we can, though I also think about the negative ramifications of editing our genome. So I'd like to ask, how do you think altering our genome will change our society, since editing it will certainly create much more differences between us, stigma, segregation, etc., and not to mention the potential for superheroes, supervillains coming from people from back alley geneticists?
So the most dystopic vision here, I think, might be the one in which we end up down the road with different species, practically. And maybe your proposal is designed precisely to try to prevent that from happening. But some of the arguments against enhancement have been that we need to preserve a common core of some sort of common understanding of humanity in order to maintain this sense of human equality that Matthew took as a sort of as an assumption, as a premise in his position. So that's the scary vision, the scariest vision.
Yeah.
I think you could almost argue the opposite. Getting back to the diversity question, the ultimate way of developing diversity is by colonizing space, and each colony has its own rules, its own speciation, and so forth. And you do experiments, and you find out what actually is sacred. At one point, the written text was illuminated manuscripts, mostly of biblical texts, and that was sacred. And then the printing press and the internet and so forth. And maybe that should have been an experiment, and we should have had one colony that went off and stuck to it, like we have the Amish and so forth. So I'm not convinced that speciation is necessarily the worst case scenario.
What about supervillains?
That sounds like worst case scenario. That sounds bad. Yeah.
But how?
Hopefully nobody's attracted to that. I mean, would you want to be a supervillain? I mean, you want to be a superhero. Everybody wants to be a superhero, right?
I think some people were going to want to release supervillains onto the world. No?
I hope not.
That's reassuring. Okay. Let's see. We have 2 minutes. That child.
Yep. He's been waiting very patiently. Yeah.
I was wondering if say we did gain the capability to create genetically modified humans or just regular humans from scratch. So what would stop the military from creating humans that had no parents and were perfectly expendable? Nobody would miss them if they died. So how would we prevent that?
So
Fair question.
yeah. So as Greg said, one of my two fundamental conditions is that there's the equality of humans, right? Everybody has the same equal moral status. So if we created these people where we're just going to use them to be super soldiers, right? Use them merely as a means, right? For some other end that they didn't choose, that would be something wrong. And so there's a question of are there going to be people who are going to do that? Possibly. But there's a question of ethics, which is, ought we do that? And the answer is we shouldn't do that. And we should do whatever we can, our society, to fight against, countries or nations or people who are going to try to do that. Because that would be sort of that would be crossing a certain ethical line that we shouldn't be doing. There are always going to be evil and, this goes into the sort of the villains, super villains. There are going to be people who are going to want to do that. But I think supervillains have to respect our equality as moral status. Whether they do in fact or not, that's a separate question, but ethically they ought.
But
Yeah.
George, you answer. Don't you feel? Do you feel some responsibility? You're going to unleash this technology on the world so that, and governments are bad. We know they're bad. They're going to try to make children who we can just say, what are you going to do to stop that?
Well, yes, I do I'm trying not to shirk responsibility, and I think that we should get in better control of our governments. That would be a nice step. I see some responsibility there. There's some effort to drop fewer atom bombs than we used to in the past. We've been pretty good since the 40s. I think we need to remove the motivation for doing that. Okay, so if the United States is not threatened, it presumably won't do it. It'll be the most threatened, the most disadvantaged that might do this as a desperation tactic. And it would be nice to address their problems so that they're not that motivated to go that route. I don't know. This is outside of my field. I mean, we can't genetically engineer people against their will to behave morally.
That's right.
Yet, anyway. So I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Do I have time for more questions? It says no more time. I'm sorry. We'll stay around.
We'll be around.
Yeah, we'll be around.
Thank you. You're a great audience.
Good. Oh, great. Yeah. That was fun.